Colonel Jonathan Conricus, thank you very much indeed for joining us today. A short background on the commander, those that don't know, he served formerly as a commander in Israel's infantry, as a liaison to the UN. He was actually then seconded to the UN for a while, the first ever IDF officer to serve in the UN, and then came back several years ago to serve as the IDF spokesman for the international media. Lieutenant Colonel, if you want to start with making some opening comments, perhaps, and then I've already got several questions that people have sent in, and then I'll encourage anyone else on the line just to raise your hand, and then we can unmute you and then bring you in to ask questions as well. So, Lieutenant Colonel, over to you.
Thank you, Richard. It's okay with me if you want to wait for a moment or two for others to join the line, because I see, I mean, it's you and I and
no, you can't see that. No, there's lots of other people on the line. You can't see. Okay. If you click down on you're good to go. We've got
great,
a good attendance.
Great. So thank you for that, and good afternoon in Israel, noon to you. I'm in a place called Yehud, which is a town in central Israel. You can see behind me is what's left of a house that was struck yesterday night, a few hours ago, by a rocket, direct hit from Gaza. It used to be a two-story building, but you can see what's left of it. There's one story, and then there's another room on top, and the rest basically obliterated by the impact of the rocket. Fortunately, the family who lives in the house were quick enough and disciplined enough to seek shelter, and therefore nothing happened to them. Nothing happened to them. Sorry, nothing happened to them, and they stayed in their domestic shelter, which saved their lives. That is one rocket out of more than 1,000 rockets that have been fired from Gaza towards Israel. That is more than, sorry, I'm just relocating as civilians here. It's a civilian area. So that's one out of more than 1,000 rockets that have been fired at Israel over the last 38 hours. Interesting fact, which is underreported in international media, is the fact that more than 200 of the rockets fired so far from Gaza, they actually fall short. They're fired from within Gaza, trying to achieve what you can see here behind me. About 90% of the rockets that actually make it towards Israel, they're intercepted, but 200 of the rockets that have been fired actually fall short and land inside Gaza. And that, I think, is something that is worth to mention. Why? Because those rockets land in Gaza, they explode, and they, of course, cause civilian damage. And I think that Hamas and the Islamic Jihad have an inherent interest in trying to pin the casualties of those things on Israel, instead of it having of them shouldering responsibility for that. We have struck more than 300 military targets belonging to Hamas and the Islamic Jihad all across the Gaza Strip, different types of targets. We've struck weapons manufacturing positions, weapons storage facilities, training ground, military compounds, headquarters, like the two high-rise buildings that we struck over the night. Both of them appear to be civilian buildings, but they are in fact headquarters in the use of Hamas, and they qualify as military targets without any doubt. And we have also struck and been so far quite successful in targeting specific terrorists. More than 20 terrorists have been killed by our direct strikes, whether it's anti-tank missile crews or anti-tank missile commanders, as well as rocket units and intel personnel belonging both to Hamas and the Islamic Jihad. So when you hear numbers of Palestinian casualties, please bear in mind that more than 20 are combatants, terrorists. Maybe you'll refer to them as militants, but they're bad guys involved in fighting. And we specifically targeted them, trying our best to avoid killing or harming people who aren't involved in the fighting, basically non-combatants. Where does this take us from now? First of all, we see this Hamas aggression and attack, the fire towards Jerusalem, which started 6 p.m. a day and a half ago, as a very severe act of aggression, and we hold Hamas accountable, and we intend to make Hamas pay the price for the aggression against us. And as you can see, they haven't quite yet gotten the message, and we will continue to operate to attack their military infrastructure and to prepare for additional activities until they do get the message. We have enlisted certain reserve personnel. We have enhanced our presence on the ground in order to strengthen our defenses, and we have enhanced our offensive fire capabilities. One last thing, an unfortunate number which I have to mention. So far, 5 Israeli civilians dead by rocket fire in Israel. All of those civilians totally unrelated to anything regarding fighting. Simply civilians killed in their homes or near their homes by rockets that were fired. And in direct relation, the number of Israelis killed and wounded would be far higher had it not been for the Iron Dome system, which has been a lifesaver, as it always is, just commemorating 10 years of the operation of that system. And we have a success rate of about 90% interception rate of their rockets. With that opening statement, I'd be more than happy to try to answer your questions.
Thank you very much. Let me start with the questions that some of the journalists have already sent in to me. And there's a common theme asked by 3 different journalists. Basically, where did Hamas get these rockets from? What's their source? Who's making them?
So Hamas has quite a vast arsenal of rockets. Some of them, a small part of their arsenal, which according to our estimates, we're talking about between 20 and 30,000 rockets in Gaza today, rockets and mortars. Sorry, I had an incoming call. Sorry, just a second. Sorry, so they have a vast arsenal of rockets. I think it's on par perhaps with fire capabilities of a few small European countries, just for reference. And unfortunately, their rockets can strike almost all of the most densely populated areas in Israel, far north of Tel Aviv. As you saw, they have the range to reach Jerusalem, and that is a threat to us. The biggest part of their arsenal is homemade, local production. Contrary to what many people perhaps think about Gaza, they're actually quite industrious when they want to. They're industrious about rocket building, and they're industrious about digging tunnels. They have quite a nice cottage industry of that going on. And they produce rockets based on blueprints and advice that they've gotten from Iran and from others. And money that they generate for themselves, as well as from using or misusing international aid. So that's regarding the weapons, and it's a very unfortunate situation that a terrorist organization has access to that kind of weaponry.
Another question here: has the IDF underestimated the threat level of Hamas rockets?
It's a good question. I don't think that we've underestimated the threat level, but I can say that the decision by Hamas to fire at Jerusalem and to continue to fire relentlessly at Israeli communities is a decision that we did not anticipate that they would do, because we thought that we had communicated clearly enough what the consequences would be. Obviously, that isn't the case. And Hamas needs to understand that in a clearer way. That's what we are in the middle of doing now, making that very clear to Hamas that we won't tolerate this type of attack and aggression against Israeli civilians.
Could you comment on the kind of on the advanced or the improvements in technology they've made in their rockets? There are suggestions that the trajectory has been able to outsmart the Iron Dome, and they've got a more advanced kind of payload that perhaps is technology they've been able to garner from Iran.
So no, the rockets are not outsmarting the Iron Dome. The Iron Dome is outstanding in its capacity to adapt to new techniques and to new methods by the enemies when they try to outsmart our systems in order to kill our civilians. And what we've seen, and I alluded to this in the beginning, is actually that there's a much higher than normal failure rate of rockets fired from Gaza, perhaps related to the fact that it's homemade, and perhaps quality assurances aren't what they should be. And it is, after all, tricky business to manufacture weapons. So it's something, of course, very interesting to understand how that came about, that they have a very high rate of rockets that fall short and land in Gaza. I'm sure that they'll be looking into it and trying to improve. But no, if at all any changes, we're talking about longer range and bigger payloads, but not maneuverability capable of overcoming our defenses. But if you look at the damage behind me again, I mean, look at the destruction and the impact, and that's just one rocket. These are sizable rockets, sizable payloads, and the general vector is that the rockets are growing in size and growing in distance.
Thank you. Regarding the casualties in Gaza, why have the civilian casualties been so high in Gaza overnight, according to the Palestinian Health Ministry? And with the accuracy of the IDF munitions, why have the IDF been unable to minimize these casualties?
So without being obtuse or cynical, even one little bit, I actually don't think that the civilian casualties are high. When you look at them when you look at cold numbers and calculations, there are more than 20 of those killed in Gaza are Hamas and Islamic Jihad operatives, combatants, by all means that we know, almost even by name, many of them that we killed. The rest may be civilians, remains confirmed. And before answering the question, I urge everybody relying on information from the Gaza Health Ministry, please keep in mind that it's a so-called health ministry that is under a terrorist organization, recognized as such even by the UK government. So bear in mind that when you quote and when you think about the veracity of information. The situation on the ground is as close to impossible as it can be in terms of Hamas knowingly, intentionally themselves within the civilian population and using the civilian population as their human shields, the civilian infrastructure, in order to protect them, and hiding their infrastructure either in between or underneath the civilian infrastructure in Gaza. That's why it's a very challenging situation. I can assure you that we do the utmost in order to minimize collateral damage. And I'll give you an example. We took down 2 towers or 2 high-rise buildings in northern Gaza, in the Rimal neighborhood. 12 or 13 stories, each one of them. It's a military target because they are offices and buildings used by Hamas, both for internal security roles, as well as intelligence headquarters and their headquarters for operations in Judea and Samaria. We knew that it's used by Hamas, and therefore it qualifies as a legitimate military target. But we, of course, know that it's in the middle of populated areas, and therefore we used different techniques in order to make sure that non-combatants and civilians were out of the area before we struck it. We used a warning shot, otherwise referred to as roof knocking, and we also called various people, more than one person in Gaza, and relayed the message that we are going to strike the building, stay clear, and tell everybody else to be clear. And we then also verified that the building was in fact vacated and that there were no civilians nearby either. The all that would be nice and fine, but what matters at the end is that it worked and that there were no civilian casualties, any casualties actually, in the destruction of those two military targets. So yes, we go to great lengths. We try to minimize the damage to civilians. The terrorist organizations on the other side are making it increasingly difficult for us to do so.
Another question here: will there be a ground offensive?
That's too early to say, but we're preparing for different scenarios. We've mobilized regular troops along the border in the Gaza division, and some of the troops are preparing for that, but that is still too early to say.
And is there a way out of this spiral towards war?
Most of the answer for that lies within Hamas's decision making. We aren't the ones who started this. We aren't the ones who started firing rockets at centers of the civilian population. We're responding to Hamas's aggression here. So it depends to be seen how fast Hamas understand the consequences of what they've done. But from our perspective, we are operating and geared to enhance and escalate the pace of our activities.
Thank you. I've got another question here on the chat, which I think you've partly answered, but maybe you could just clarify on the quality of the ordinance that they've been using, and if there has been a big leap in advancements over the previous years.
Yeah, so I don't want to repeat all of it, but I'd say that we've seen there's a constant expansion in terms of range and also in terms of the size of the warheads. It's still too early. I don't have results of EOD analysis available to me yet, but from my basic experience, having seen a few impact zones before, what I'm looking at looks like a lot of damage caused by one rocket, but we'll have to establish that on a more professional level. But the rockets are bigger in size and longer in range.
I mean, how would you quantify, is Hamas stronger than it was in 2014?
That's a good question. It depends on if you look at it from a strategic perspective or only from a military perspective. And you could tell the tale many ways. I'd say that they're limited in terms of the weapons that they have at their disposal, and that we have found quite effective countermeasures to most of their offensive efforts, both suicide bombers, attack tunnels, as well as their rockets. Yes, the rockets can still hit randomly, and yes, the rockets definitely terrorize, but are they capable of causing significant military damage? Not quite. So it's really a more philosophical question, and you could go at it either way. We're not focusing on that right now.
Thank you. Can you tell us a little bit about this incident this morning with the drone that came out of Gaza that was taken out?
Yeah, there's various efforts by Hamas and the PIJ using drones and anti-tank missile fire. We unfortunately have an incident with casualties as well along the border. We're still finalizing details in order to understand exactly what happened on the ground, but we understand that there was an anti-tank missile fired towards a vehicle close to the border. And there was an attempt by Hamas to use a drone in order to fly across the border and attack one of our positions. That was intercepted by the Iron Dome, and that attack was thwarted. And there was also an attempt worth mentioning of elite unit of Hamas terrorists that tried to use a tunnel in order to dig under the border and emerge inside Israel. We had advance information regarding that effort, and we were able to cause the tunnel to implode and effectively capture or yeah, you would say capture or well, no, not capture, but they're stuck in the tunnel. These terrorists that happened in the southern part of the Gaza Strip just a few hours ago.
Thank you. A couple more questions on the chat we've got here. How much do you foresee a possible coordinated attack from the north, from either Lebanon, Syria, and what's Hezbollah's role at the moment?
So far, that front is quiet. We're vigilant, looking, listening, assessing, and preparing for various scenarios, but so far that front is quiet.
And a related question, I'm quoting, some people are saying that the Hamas rockets are testing defenses for the bigger and more dangerous Hezbollah arsenal. Do you see it like this? What lessons for dealing with can we learn from dealing with Hezbollah's weaponry?
Yeah, Hezbollah definitely has more weapons, bigger weapons, and they're better deployed, and they enjoy many advantages that Hamas doesn't enjoy in terms of having a state backing them and many other things. But and of course, whenever things happen, then all terrorists are looking and learning and assessing. That's why it's also important to deliver a strong message here and to deliver significant military damage to Hamas so that any other terrorists who might get trigger happy understand the consequences of their actions.
Another question here. Could you comment on if you're seeing more support for Hamas amongst the Israeli Arab population?
So in general, I don't, it's not my area of responsibility, and I don't speak about internal events. We'll have to ask the Israeli police. I read reports, but it's really not my area of responsibility.
And what about the kind of the general level of alertness or concern for potential terror attacks in the West Bank?
So there have been attempts over the last 2 days. All of them have been successfully thwarted. And we, of course, know from past experience that whenever there's fighting anywhere else, then there's always the possible spillover effect. So we're elevated readiness, trying to minimize risk, minimize friction, and to avoid any known hotspots or flashpoints. And so far that's working. But of course, that is a threat and something that we're very mindful of.
Could you say anything about the mechanism? I know Israel, we understand, has rejected any calls for initial ceasefire. But could you say a word about the mechanism involved in Israel's liaison, either with Egypt or Qatar or the UN?
Yeah, I have no visibility on that. And on the military level, I'm sorry about the noise. On the military level, not something that the IDF deals with. Our orders, our marching orders are clear. Defend, strike militants and their infrastructure in Gaza, strike their capabilities, and prepare to enhance operations. Those are marching orders, and that's what we're doing.
And how would you quantify or calibrate a victory and success when you can call the operation to an end?
That should be defined by our political echelon or by the national leadership. And in terms of our perspective, so far what we're aiming to do is to deliver a strong enough message to Hamas to have them understand that what they did, fire at Jerusalem and the continuous relentless rocket fire towards the south, and of course towards Tel Aviv and central Israel, is unacceptable and will not be tolerated.
Is there any suggestion with the payload of these rockets and the distance that they're traveling, that there is any technology that Hamas has been able to garner from Iran?
We don't need these events in order to know that. We know that the Iranian engineers and military experts have been aiding Hamas, and they've been part of the Hamas manufacturing industry, the weapons industry, for quite some time. So that isn't new, and we know that for a fact that the Iranian engineers have been supporting the local Hamas weapons industry.
And so, I mean, if there's been kit that's been smuggled in, how would you see, has that come through the sea, or there's still tunnels that the Egyptians haven't fully dismantled into from the Sinai?
There's still a highway of tunnels from Sinai into Gaza under that small part of the border, and that's where most of the standard grade weapons come in. For instance, they have anti-tank missiles, Cornet missiles, that they just fired today, 2 of them. Hamas doesn't possess the capability to manufacture those by themselves. That's complicated. So they are delivered by usually Iranian money or directly delivered from Iran. And they typically are smuggled under the border via Sinai.
Apart from the Iranians, is there anyone else who are actively involved in that weapon smuggling process?
As far as we know, it's autonomous activity by Hamas, and the biggest external supporter would be Iran.
And again,
I have time for one more question, Richard.
Okay. I think we've actually gone through all the questions that we have. If anyone wants to raise their hand and ask any last question, 1 second. We've done that one. If I can ask, your assessment standing here is very difficult on Wednesday morning. Is how long do you think Hamas can sustain this this attack, and what's the time frame that you think at the moment?
Unfortunately, Hamas has been able to stockpile weapons, quite sizable amounts. So in terms of capabilities, they have the combat capability to sustain operations and fire for a significant period of time. I won't say the specific number for operational security reasons, because it's an IDF assessment. But it's not only about capabilities, it's also about intentions and willpower. So remains to be seen how much Hamas will want to suffer from the consequences of their actions, and how much they're willing to forfeit in terms of infrastructure and capabilities because of their attack against us. So I have, just as a final sentence there's no time cap. And from our point of view, we're adding capabilities, adding preparations, generating new targets, and continuing to respond to their attacks against us.
Okay, Lieutenant Colonel, thank you very much indeed. Thank you all for joining us. We hope that was useful, and if it's okay, we hope we don't need to, but we may call on you again in the days ahead if and when necessary.
Something tells me we'll see each other again soon.
Okay, stay safe down there. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you very much. Goodbye to everybody. Shalom.